Georgia! Oh, thank you.
Give us a smile.
Will 10-month-old Georgia grow up to be a hooligan? What about Owen, Hannah, or Brittany? The government says it's possible to spot the problem individuals of the future while they're still in romper suits. No, these are not them. Their parents attend sessions to ensure the best possible upbringing for their kids. But the Prime Minister says if problem parents refuse such support, the state should step in.
If we're not prepared to predict and intervene far more early, then there are children that are going to grow up in families that we know perfectly well are completely dysfunctional, and the kids a few years down the line are going to be a menace to society and actually a threat to themselves.
I'm interested in how early, because a lot of the evidence suggests you need to be getting in there while the child is still in nappies, frankly.
Or pre-birth, even. We should be intervening far earlier, making it clear that in those circumstances, from a very early age, there's going to be support, but also some sense of discipline and framework put in place in order to make sure that that child gets a better start in life.
Government experts reckon that if you wait until adulthood, a dysfunctional person costs the taxpayer on average £25,000 a year. Even at nursery and primary school age, children can have developed profound behavioural problems that will blight their life chances. Hence the focus on identifying and intervening as early as possible. The plan is for health visitors to flag up obvious problems, a computer system to identify babies growing up with multiple disadvantages, and once alarm bells ring, tailored support offered. But if the family refuses help, sanctions might include withdrawal of benefits, court orders, and ultimately the children taken into care. Early intervention is key to the approach on this housing project in York. Run by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, new parents, whatever their circumstances, can take advantage of a range of early support. Elsewhere, it's felt, agencies often fail to act soon enough.
The reality is, if you want to get social services involved in that family, then basically you've got to have a bruised baby on your hands. The threshold is that high. And we believe that, we don't wait for that to happen. We pick up on the signs at a very early point and we get in there.
And secondly, within what framework?
As Mr Blair comes towards the end of his premiership, he's anxious to leave his mark and prepared to take political risks. He knows that targeting babies and toddlers in his crusade against antisocial behaviour is bound to make headlines.
That group of families that are severely dysfunctional, that have multiple problems, there is no point in sort of pussyfooting around the issue.
That's scary for people, this is Big Brother. This is that kid there is a problem of the future. We must go in.
Yeah, but you're going in to offer help and support. For example,
you may be going in to say you're not going to accept our support, so we'll take your child away.
Well, you've got to look after the interests of the child.
But the idea that the state should intervene in how families bring up their children before problems occur is extremely contentious.
The government is trying to take over a parenting role. I mean, the idea of removing children, the proposal isn't completely clear, but the suggestion that children would be removed is not actually tackling the problem.
The answer isn't more state intervention. It's to encourage the social enterprises, the voluntary sector, the community groups, to help people without trying to run their lives for them.
Ministers in your government, there's no new money for any of this. They are going to have to shift resources to put this plan into action. And they may already be looking and saying, well, we know Tony's not going to be around perhaps in a year or two, and they're looking at the next guy, aren't they?
Yeah, but I think that anybody who looks at this problem will come to pretty much the same type of conclusion. Well, I think so, and the work that we've been doing recently has been an indication of that.
He doesn't want to talk about when he's leaving, but expects a lot more on social exclusion. A keynote speech next week and a government-wide plan the week after. But Tony Blair's problem is that he's a short-term PM, proposing long-term policies. Mark Easton, BBC News.
So we've just watched a video of Tony Blair speaking to the BBC while he was Prime Minister about an approach to child protection using predictive analytics. That means profiling families based on a number of risk factors and predicting which children are bound, according to their theories, to have bad life outcomes, and therefore should be removed from their families. Now, this is quite a problematic approach when you understand that children who grow up in care, statistically, are, potentially, and this is, it's not a death sentence, it's not, condemning children. There are, many children in care, go on to live perfectly good lives, but statistically, they have the worst life outcomes and are the most marginalised people in our society. So why would we be putting children in care unless we, if we can help it? According to the law, permanent removal of children from their families is a last resort, and permanence is represented by adoption. So this is just talking about one part of the family justice system, which is in the UK called public family law, which is child protection. The other side of the coin, and not everybody understands that these are sort of two sides of the same coin, is private family law and divorce and child custody. The thing that's interesting for me is the involvement of Tony Blair and the knowledge that we have that he had quite close links with Bill Clinton in the US at the time, and that in both countries there were changes to the legislation during their tenure that resulted in the laws that we have today, which many people consider to be very harmful to children and families. Now, I'm not in the area of child protection, so I'm not going to speak too much about this. And I want to caveat all of this heavily with the statement that I'm just talking about things which I can see from my perspective, which I don't think get discussed enough. And I am absolutely 100% sure that there are many other people out there who can see things from many other perspectives, who would be able to identify all of these myriad causes for a perfect storm, which is causing the family court scandal. It's not a problem with one cause, there are many causes, which makes it quite complex. Yeah, I'll sort of crack on a little bit and talk about, the causes of the problem. This is still from a video in which a lady who's going to speak later on today at 4 o'clock UK time, 5 o'clock European time, Roly Post. She's a former European Commission official who was tasked in 1999 with the child protection portfolio. And she worked a lot in Romania, where the pro-adoption lobbies were very active at the time, causing what's called a national tragedy in Romania of international adoption, where I'm not quite sure of the figure, but I believe it's at least more than 1,000 Romanian children were adopted out abroad, and not to Romanian families like this man. He was a Romanian man who, together with his partner, wanted to adopt a child and found and many parents in their situation in Romania couldn't. Why? Because Romanian children were able to fetch higher prices for the organizations involved in international adoptions abroad than they were in Romania. So this resulted in the severance of these children's ties with their culture and language, permanent severance with their families. Now, these were there was propaganda going around that these were orphans. Many of them were not orphans, but they did have families who were poor, and they just needed a little bit of financial support. We'll put the links to both of these videos under the YouTube channel, and I'll put it in the chat later. One situation was that these Romanian mothers found during the winter time that they were unable to heat their homes, so they would take their children to children's homes where they could be kept warm and fed during the very hard winter months, and then they would come and collect them. But then they were starting to find, when they came for their children, that they were there no longer. And for example, they changed the laws saying, well, if the parents didn't come for their children within X period of time, they then revoked the parental rights. Now, the parents didn't necessarily know that. Sometimes they were not informed. They were poor. They lived a long way away from the cities where their children were in care and could not travel within those time frames. So this was all desperately unfair. But what this man points out is politics and money should have nothing to do with children. I strongly believe that that's the case, and friends from Support Not Separation pointed that out earlier. But I would say there's a third pillar to this rather dark story, and that is abuse and networks of people with nefarious aims who are managing to get into the sort of child protection and adoption landscape. So yeah, those are the three pillars: ideology, money, and abuse. And I'm not talking off the top of my head here. I had a conversation with a very experienced senior lawyer and academic who, without me prompting, actually identified these three causes of the problem herself. There's the link to the video. I'll make sure it's available for everybody. And as I say, the child protection business model, there's some contention around where it actually comes from. So if in the UK and Europe, it feels a bit like it's the CPS model from the United States, which is getting copied and pasted in other jurisdictions. Now, I watched a video a day or two ago about the Irish mother and baby homes, where unmarried mothers were targeted by the Catholic, actually not just the Catholic, the Protestant church as well. And this is where Ireland comes in. Apparently, and what these campaigners and researchers and surviving child victims of the scandal were saying was, in the 1950s in Ireland, the church worked out how to monetize child removal. So these unmarried mothers were viewed socially as undesirable, that the children were taken, so the mothers were discarded. And then some of the children unfortunately did not survive. There are mass graves of these children who are in these homes. It's utterly shocking. We'll hear about that tomorrow at 3:30. But they worked out that they could actually sell the children and make a healthy profit. I can provide a link to a documentary where these survivors found out how much were paid for their adoption, and whether or not it was legal. Whoops, Daisy, I'm so sorry. In the private law arena, we're tracing the cause of the problems that we're seeing, this perverse outcomes where the child is ending up with the wrong parent, the abusive parent, to a organization called the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. Later today at 7 o'clock UK time, we'll be welcoming a researcher called Doreen Ludwig, who's going to explain more about the AFCC, which she describes as a trade association, and how it's impacting private child custody cases in the United States. That's a screenshot from their website. And this is a list of all of the different kinds of professionals who get involved in child custody cases. And the thing is that very many of these are privately paid. So, for example, if you're in a child custody case and you're court ordered to go and see a mental health practitioner of some kind or another, they are not from the NHS, the public health services in the United Kingdom or in Europe, in my experience, but they are private practitioners. And what I've heard is that these are practitioners who are viewed in a rather dim light by people who are, practicing mental health professionals in, state public health services. United States, example, custody evaluators and people who are practicing what's called reunification therapy, some of whom have criminal records, are commanding fees of as much as $1,500 an hour to perform these services, which are a form of conversion therapy and highly harmful to children. Some United States, US states are managing to ban this practice at the moment. So there's just this pile on, including contact centres. Many parents find themselves having to pay to be able to see their own children, mediators, the list goes on. There's an academic called Martha Albertson Feynman, who is one of writes some of the many books which I know that I must read, but I haven't, but I've got the luxury of other people who have and who are informing me about what is contained in her books. So she basically talks about this sort of proliferation of professionals who pile in to the family courts, which become not a legal jurisdiction, but a therapeutic jurisdiction. Actually, I started reading another book right now, which I was going to waive, but I've only got it in electronic form, and I can share the link if you. It's by a professor called Jane Spinks, who studies, I think it's the crossover between psychiatry and law in the United States. It's called The End of Family Court. She has been also talking about therapeutic jurisdiction, which is, she says, one of those things which started out as a good intention, saying, well, the family court should be much more informal and the judges shouldn't be bound by these very harsh laws, which are sometimes inflexible, but should have much more leeway and, to be able to adapt to the needs of that particular child and family. But there's an example of the road to good intentions the road to hell being paved with good intentions. What's actually happening is this gives judges the carte blanche to do what they like. They don't have to take account of the law, and there is no accountability mechanism to address it when they don't. Sorry. Yeah. So how is this spreading? Aurelie Post is also going to talk about the role of NGOs and lobbies. One form of lobbies is think tanks, and the Centre for Social Justice is a think tank. There are people on the call who probably recognise the name Ian Duncan Smith, I think he's a current MP who was quite instrumental in setting up the Centre for Social Justice. There are links with US far-right groups and the Centre for Social Justice. This is an excerpt from a document prepared by a UK citizen researcher who has a website called the Centre for Social Injustice, who noticed some very strange things going on in the child maintenance service. And she points out that one of the directors of the Family Hubs network, an academic called Samantha Callan, had written a paper which was condemned by domestic abuse organisations for denying that there is a gendered aspect to abuse. It doesn't mean that men are cannot be abused, but it does mean that it is disproportionately women who are impacted, for victim blaming and for focusing on healing the perpetrators and reintegrating them with the family rather than actually protecting the victim and the child. So this is something that has had a deleterious effect on private family law cases. Sorry, I'm just going to mute the chat because I find it a bit disturbing for myself. Yeah, causing these outcomes where we know that there are large numbers of children who have ended up with abusive parents against their will, sometimes in very dangerous situations with parents who are convicted batterers, where there is strong, compelling evidence that the child has been sexually abused, even in cases where, there are cases where it's been discussed how much contact a young child should have with a father who is being sentenced at the time for sexually abusing their older sibling, not whether they should have contact with them. So it is causing objectively extremely dangerous situations with serious abuse, and causing potentially irreparable harm to, we don't know how many children yet, we need to find out. We know that in 2012, at the point where the British government cut legal aid for family law cases, they also stopped collecting data on outcomes, and this is why we do not know. But somebody's raised a question of whether we can get an FOI request honoured to find out exactly how many children have ended up with parents where there has been abuse raised. And the question is, whether that abuse was evidenced and whether that evidence was acted on. Concerning about the Centre for Social Justice, that would you mind everybody putting yourselves on mute so that I can mute you? There we go. These policies, which are about reuniting families at all costs and punishing victims of either gender who want to leave an abusive relationship, whether it's them or their children or both, usually, who are the victims of the abuse. These are ideologies which are becoming embedded throughout UK public services, and the same is happening in Europe because these lobbies are active internationally. So what we can see here is that Samantha Callan has a senior position in the Department for Work and Pensions, which administers child maintenance payments. It administers benefits. It's getting embedded in education and healthcare systems. And one of the mechanisms that is tying this all together is the Family Hubs network, which is being rolled out across the country, and promises that they will know, they will be gathering information. They don't need your consent. They can have your implicit consent, which you might have trouble withdrawing. They're gathering information across healthcare, so education, giving it to social services. This is how predictive analytics will be being used to identify families who are a potential risk of harm, for example, because they themselves were abused either as children or adults, and therefore remove their children, even though there have never been any allegations of harm against them. Now, this is absolutely shocking. CAFCAS is the UK organisation which is disseminating these ideologies most heavily. It's directly involved in children's law cases because it's the UK Court Services for Children, and it is also providing training to social work services across the country, we believe probably to education, etc., etc. But when we look at CAFCAS's reviews on Trustpilot, the only reason why they have got 1 star, people say in the comments, is because the platform won't let them award 0 stars. Now, if CAFCAS was doing a half decent job, you would assume that it would be getting at least 2.5 stars, that, one party would always be satisfied. But it seems that nobody is satisfied. And how can we say that this is a public service which is justifying the public money which is being spent on it? another campaigner in the UK against the family courts. I don't know if you can join us this weekend, Phil Woods, who has a podcast called A Dark World, wrote this article where parents sent in evidence of their enormous problems with Kafkas, including in this picture a man who decided that it was appropriate to send a mother in child custody proceedings a picture of his penis. She complained about it. He was not taken off the case. It was said, well, we couldn't be sure whose penis it was that he sent her a picture of, whether it was his or somebody else's, as if that makes a difference. And then he made recommendations that the mother's child should be removed. I think it is really superfluous to say that this is stuff that makes your blood run cold. Kafkas is a member organisation of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, and I think it will say, I'm sorry, this is a presentation that I prepared quite a long time ago. It says in this screenshot, so is the president of the family division of the UK court system, Sir Andrew McFarlane, people who are involved in Kafkas, and also the Nuffield Foundation, which runs the, what's it called, Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Now, there are people who have been listed as AFCC members who are not malign, but these covert networks and the amount of money which are being generated by what is called cottage industries of psychotherapists and sometimes unregulated experts, but regulated also, is something that should be of concern, because right there is where you get money and children mixing together. And there is ideology in the mix because, as we said, you know, there's this sort of fundamentalist Christian, male supremacist, and very often racist, ableist ideology as well, which says, you know, that families should remain together despite any abuse, which is being absorbed by certain members of the family. I've come across actually a UK politician, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, saying that, I think it may have been Ian Duncan Smith actually, we can't have, you know, single men rattling around the streets because, you know, they'll get violent and cause a disturbance. They should be at home where the mothers and children should be absorbed. Well, he didn't put it in those words, but that's what they expect, you know, that the victims and the children are expected to absorb the punches, mainly mothers, but it can be fathers too. By the way, when I say punches, you know, it can be emotional as well, and all other kinds of abuse, which are no less harmful and insidious than physical beatings. Oh, yeah, there is so much conflict.
Who's got mommy and me tomorrow? Oh, that's me. First shower.
Everybody go on to mute, please. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Conflict of interest are the rule rather than the exception in the family justice system, to the point where I suspect that it is actually actively encouraged rather than seen as something that's dangerous and harmful and unlawful. Trying to remember. Yeah, so this was.
I just say there's no conflict of interest in law.
Okay, that's fine, but it certainly is problematic. Melanie Gill is one of the practitioners of parental alienation sort of assessments and therapies, who has been implicated in several high-profile and very concerning cases involving allegations of child abuse, who was the subject of an appeal which was heard by the president of the family division, Sir Andrew McFarlane, despite the fact that there is ample evidence that the two of them are actually very, closely connected, in a professional manner. And this seems to be concerning, and perhaps might, then lead us not to be surprised when this mother's appeal was not upheld. Not only that, but she was ordered to pay not only her costs for the appeal, but also the costs of the father, and also the Association of Clinical Psychologists, who came in as a third party to advocate for the mother and express concern about the use of unregulated mental health practitioners, was also ordered to pay costs. So this is a chilling effect on anybody who would, in a professional capacity, like to assist parents with appealing these highly concerning cases. Child contact centres I've already mentioned as being another money profit centre. I've come across mothers in the United States and America. I can't speak for fathers because I haven't come across cases, but I do know about fathers who have to pay to see their children as well, sometimes because of abuse, but maybe not always. This is a list of the patrons of the National Association of Child Contact Centres in the United Kingdom. They are all current or former judges. Now, is there any kind of interest of any of the people involved in forcing parents who lose custody of their children to pay for the privilege of seeing them, especially when they're entirely innocent? By the way, I'm aware that I'm glossing over a lot of it because there's a lot of material to get through. I don't have all the answers, but this is why we're here, to sort of come together and try and share information and put the pieces of the puzzle together. Yes, so this is the size of the family law industry in the United Kingdom, almost £2 billion in 2021. I'm not sure if that includes the ancillary services like mental health practitioners or not. In the United States, I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but I'm led to believe that the figure of close to 60 billion is probably closer to the truth. Yeah, I've seen in the chat that there have been concerns raised about certain groups which are promoting the interests of fathers who we've seen recently very much have a relationship with members of the family justice system. They have Sir Andrew McFarlane and other presidents of the family courts attending their conferences on a regular basis. And we understand that there are frequent informal meetings as well. But when they've been invited to attend conferences with mothers who are organising them, the request has been turned down. But what I want to talk about here is how there is a sort of potential trouble ahead with the domestic abuse sector, which led me to sort of muse last night, having looked more into the Irish mother and baby homes, whether in some cases we're actually creating a new set of mother and baby homes in the domestic abuse sector itself. So at 7 o'clock today, Doreen Ludwig will be talking about these networks, as I've talked about before, in the family courts, but also encompassing the domestic abuse sector. Doreen is an author with lived experience of the system. She's been researching it for very many years, and she has first-hand knowledge of how the same funding streams, which are coming from the fatherhood movement, which is keeping families together at all costs for financial reasons as well as ideological, are actually impacting what we think to be women's services as well. So I don't know if she's still on the call. Deborah from Resolute Women's Support raised concerns about a pregnant woman who she was trying to assist, who was put into a refuge, which looks a little bit more like a prison cell, and endured a night of people who she suspects to have been drug dealers trying to batter down the door, and who was monitored with closed circuit TV cameras inside the room. Imagine being pregnant and being in such a terrifying situation. This is not healthy. I've come across other women who have reported serious problems inside domestic abuse refuges, which give rise to concern that they can or may be used in some, but hopefully not all cases, for the trafficking of women, both institutionally. So a mother is trapped inside a domestic abuse refuge for a long time. She has nowhere to go, and ends up so stressed because she may be being dealt with by staff who are not trained in dealing with traumatized victims, being referred to children's services. So there's a pathway into care. But I've heard from a social worker that when she was working inside a refuge, there were phone calls coming from third parties inquiring about residents of the refuge, and she shares my concern that there may be people who are illegally targeting women inside refuges too. So that's why I think Deborah might agree with me, or I've seen something to the effect that we shouldn't be locking up women in refuges. I'm calling these like nursing homes for working age women. Now, my own experience with domestic abuse services as well included an instance where I was accused of parental alienation simply because I was going through years and years of following the kidnap of my children, of abuse, of court proceedings which were taking years and run in a highly irregular manner. I was stressed beyond belief. And how are you supposed to hide all of this from your children? It's very, very difficult to explain certain things that are going on, and especially, you know, when their residence is changed without their will. So this person, she was actually on Twitter, you know, making comments which seemed highly inappropriate, and claiming to be researching parental alienation, but also an independent domestic abuse advocate. So if this is what's happening in domestic abuse sector, then that is something we really need to worry about. So conflicts of interest, I've actually sort of researched these further since I put these slides together and written quite an extensive Substack piece about it. They include ambulance chasing, which means funneling victims towards certain legal services, which the victims then report as not representing them adequately. Counselling victims of abuse, but then actually supporting the perpetrator in court. Yeah, conflict of interest when the domestic abuse service is run by a local authority, which is also taking children into care, and we suspect that there are profit incentives involved in doing so. Yeah, so what Doreen will be talking about later is about how the domestic abuse sector, even though it may have started out quite differently, may be morphing into an industry itself. And in fact, it has, in large part in the United States, not, again, in all instances. I'm sure there are services which are independent. That's very important and wholly, you know, commendable. But I know of a shelter in California and Silicon Valley, which is currently the subject of complaints by 65 women who've complained that they were harmed by that particular organisation. Yeah, in the United Kingdom, we have a domestic abuse commissioner who's American. We seem to be seeing the same models being built up very rapidly in the UK in the domestic abuse sector. Just as we've seen the US family court models being copy-pasted into our policy. This was a Substack piece that I wrote following this report, which I felt really did not get to the heart of the crucial issues about the domestic, about the family courts. And in fact, that article has caught the eye of quite some number of people, including US psychiatrist Dr. Bandy X. Lee, who on the back of that invited me to testify to a panel of Harvard professors in psychiatry and law about my experiences, together with a mother from the United States. And in a similar way, the piece that I published very recently about domestic abuse is getting validation from mothers saying, yes, this is happening to me. Basically, what we're seeing is the commissioners, not just the domestic abuse commissioners, but the children's commissioner. Why have we not heard from her about the family court scandal? Same with other commissioners, ombudsmen and regulators. Are they there to protect the public, or are they there to protect industry and government? So let me just check how I'm doing for time. Sorry that this is quite long, and we'll make time for questions and comments, but I would like to suggest that this is a piece of work that we take forward. This is going to take hours of us meeting like this and putting our thoughts and heads together to work out the truth about what's really going on. But first of all, I'd just like to sort of share a few thoughts about an approach to going about fixing the problem. So we've heard about the harm report, which identified things that are a fact, that we know are happening to mothers and children. Whether we know the whole story from the harm report is another matter. But the fact is that there were proposals from the harm report which have not been implemented, sort of as the years have passed. And from my line of work, the harm report seems to me like a piece of what's called discovery research, which should then have been taken as a sort of starting point for a full-scale transformation project of a very critical public service. And that kind of transformation project is usually put out to tender and taken on by a consultancy. Now, this is problematic in itself because it does depend which consultancy, how good they are, but at least there should be some kind of transparency over how the work is done, who is involved, and there is a set of guidelines about how it should be done. And there are monitoring mechanisms to make sure that whoever is delivering the project is meeting these guidelines. And that is what's called the government service standard. It is mandatory. So I've highlighted some of the important points here, which are you've got to understand users and their needs. And that's actually the work that I do. The way that you do that is you go out and talk to the users. And users might include judges and lawyers, for example, because they are, professionals who are in a way participating or using the justice system, or maybe we might rather call them stakeholders. But the users very much are the parents and maybe extended family members who might be brought into family law, for example, in kinship care situations. They're supposed to be front and center in the design of public services, and I'm not quite sure to what extent you feel that you've been consulted or involved or able, your voice has been heard in relation to, proposals for what reform should look like. And crucially, the beneficiaries of the services are children. And we hear again and again about the best interests of the child, and it's in the Children's Act, that has to be front and centre. But who is defining the best interests of the child? Where is the voice of the child? At the moment, it's silenced. I think we can all agree on that. So, yeah, secondly, solving a whole problem for users. The journey should be navigable from start to finish. It shouldn't be so opaque, with so many acronyms and practice guidelines, which quite frankly, neither judges nor lawyers are familiar with either. So how are litigants supposed to be? And making sure everyone can use the service and that it works for everyone. What about service users with disabilities, neurodiversity? What about people who have digital exclusion issues because they can't afford them? What about people from certain racial and ethnic groups who don't speak English as their first language? Are they being considered in the current sort of proposals for reform of the justice system? Yeah, so this is the real thing that's supposed to be front and center. You're supposed to understand the users, and we're supposed to be being listened to. Yeah, so we should be being interviewed, by people who are independent. They're not supposed to be judges and lawyers designing the family justice system. They're supposed to be, sort of surveying the ecosystem and speaking to everybody across it, taking in all kinds of demographic groups and things. That's not happening. Yeah, and like I say, it needs to be assessed. Yeah. And this is a transactional service. Personal data gets passed in between you and the justice system, and residence of children gets transferred as well. I would say, in very stark terms, that is a transaction. So, yeah. What I suspect has been happening is somebody has come along and said, well, you know what, this family justice system, I don't think that that's really something we want to let out of our control, so we'll take hold of it. And what I do know is that there are working groups within the judiciary which are very opaque as well, which have a sort of tokenistic representation of service users, which are quietly designing what they believe to be the ideal family justice system behind closed doors. And I've had a peek behind those doors and seen some of the policy papers that come out, and they do things like monitoring parents' eye contact threshold. So a victim of domestic abuse is supposed to be able to make and hold eye contact with the person who has been abusing him or her, otherwise they will be deemed to being not cooperative enough, and then they will be re-victimized and face having their children taken. Yes, I can certainly provide a link to the presentation. This will be on YouTube as well. Yeah. So, what a mess. This is a book I'm reading which is about the failures of regulation across the system, across the whole of society, basically. We've got a society now which has been going through radical change, and one of those changes is the sort of mass privatization of public life, which has led to immense problems with regulation, because regulators have got a plethora of private individuals and organizations that they're supposed to oversee, but that's probably not the only problem with regulation. But we've got a problem which is of such magnitude and such depth that and I would like to sort of share a point also made in this book. Sometimes steps which are ridiculed for being radical and dangerous, like the innovation of the weekend and sewerage systems, actually become part of our lives, and things that we actually cannot imagine life without. So even though we can't see a way out of things at the moment. I would really encourage bold thinking about what the system should look like and how we can get there. And as we saw with COVID, when government wants to do something, government can do it very, very quickly. Same with the post office people. They fought for more than 20 years and then a documentary produced change within a week. Funny that, isn't it? Yeah. Problems with the civil justice system. I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but I feel these are quite important points. Judges are frequently cited by litigants, including people during this weekend gathering, to be in conflict of interest. Now, how many judges have got interests in care homes, for example, or how many judges have got offshore bank accounts? How many judges are Freemasons? This is something that's cited quite often, etc., etc., and etc. My case took place in Croatia, where the president of the Supreme Court required all courts across the country to submit registers of the professional and personal interests of judges. Same thing has been, I believe, mandated in Scotland, although I don't know if it's being taken forward yet. But wouldn't that aid transparency to know, you know, whether there was any kind of question over the impartiality of the judges hearing our cases? So, hang on, how much have I got? Yeah. This was something I wrote before the post office scandal came out, but what I think we need to be asking about is an urgent package of measures for victims of the family court scandal. So I believe that they should include things like an immediate moratorium on all family law cases, basically a red light stop and find out what is going on urgently, involve families in it centrally, you know, to listen to them and hear of what exactly is going on. A mechanism maybe like a civil council to oversee any kind of reform, but also the implementation of it, data collection and monitoring of, you know, to see whether there are any things jumping out, you know, that seem odd, that shouldn't be happening. An emergency case review for families who've already been impacted, and a rescue package for victims, financial, probably primarily, because if they had the money to get the help they needed, then I believe families could probably take care of themselves much better than any intervention coming from the state that they've already had quite enough of. Thank you very much. And then finally, the urgent family justice redesign. Or should we be looking at a more comprehensive picture of family justice reform? And this is something that I worked on with a gentleman who has been impacted by what he believes is corruption in his case, which wasn't a family justice case. And this is why I believe that we need to look outside of the family jurisdiction and find the same patterns happening elsewhere, because we found a lot of commonalities between my case and his, which was financial. The overarching aims of this would be restoring independence of the judiciary and the separation of powers. So now, with the post office scandal, the judiciary is saying, oh, but we can't have Parliament intervening into court cases too much. Well, quite, because the judiciary perhaps should be getting it right first time a little bit more often than they might be doing right now. Second, restoring respect for legal, civil, constitutional and human rights of citizens, which currently seem to be absolutely absent in family law cases. Thirdly, restoring the rule of law in our country and in countries across the world, upgrading democracy so it's actually working for citizens at the grassroots level, rather than justice system and parliament being mechanisms which work for elites in inverted commas, but not in the public interest. And finally, most of us all once thought we had a justice system to be proud of. Well, maybe we've had a wake-up call, but it would be nice to restore the reputation of the British justice system, and I believe we can do that. Second layer there is addressing lobbying and how policy is used to undermine the law. This is very undemocratic. I don't know how many people realise it's happening. It's also happening in Parliament as well as in policy making and justice. Very, very good book here. I don't know if I've got it to hand. No, again, it's electronic. How Westminster Works by Ian Dunt. Really eye-opening. We've got to understand how democracy works in order to be able to access our rights as families and citizens. Resolving legal issues with the family jurisdiction, ending the abuse of the concept of judicial discretion, also happening in civil law outside of family law, and the impact of the 51% balance of probabilities, which can lead people to suffer horrific outcomes on the very, very flimsiest of proof, or sometimes no proof at all, or the absolute opposite of the proof. Dealing with structural issues like the inaccessibility of the system, its overcomplicatedness, support, making things much easier for people to be able to represent themselves in court without a lawyer if they want to. What to do about legal aid, ? Because of concerns that legal aid might be a mechanism that's being abused. Maybe we need to be empowering families to access justice directly much more, rather than having to go through a middleman of a lawyer, which is another industry. Addressing misaligned incentives throughout the system. So, for example, local authorities, are there incentives to take children into care? How are lawyers incentivized? Are they incentivized to drag cases out, or are they incentivized to resolve them quickly and satisfactorily? And how do we quantify that? The right to free transcripts and tamper-proof recordings, transparency of operation of the courts, we're already working on that. Data collection, monitoring, independent civil oversight. More transparent and fairer appointment of judges, and of other key roles. So, for example, I don't know if you know that one of the CEOs of the Post Office during the worst years of the scandal, Tim Parker, went on to be CEO of Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service for a number of years. This is what we call failing upward. Or being transferred sideways, or just shift them to somewhere else where they can cause an awful lot of trouble and problems in another area without people's knowledge. Training of judges and magistrates, it's contentious, because in family law, I think most of us have understood by now, it's not about training, at least in the majority of cases. There might be some judges who are happy to learn, but we know that there are judges who are intentionally ignoring our evidence and putting our children into situations that objectively no child should be put into. Securing the right to a fair trial, preventing conflict of interest, tackling corruption and perjury, meaningful sanctions for mis- and malfeasance. For judicial misconduct, it's very difficult to secure any kind of sanctions for judicial misconduct right now. Banning the use of vexatious and abusive litigation, which takes up an immense amount of court time. The right to ask for a trial, but jury trial, if you feel that things are going badly against you and that you need some oversight. The right to a legal remedy. Currently in the UK, there is no effective appeals process, and it goes the same elsewhere too. Meaningful complaints mechanisms. I know that that's being talked about by some other people too. Proper regulation. What is going on? with the solicitors regulation authorities, with the bar, with the HCPC and other organisations in the UK and their counterparts abroad, and automatic, meaningful compensation and redress for miscarriages of justice. So that's just a few of my ideas. It's certainly not comprehensive. So, folks, I would say this is about us taking some of these ideas to Parliament. Well, first of all, we need to agree between us, what is it that we're fighting for? You know, what do we want to achieve? You know, what can we agree on together? I think that some of the stuff I've been talking about maybe takes a little bit out of the heat, out of the conflict of, you know, the mothers versus the fathers. I think we can all agree everybody has the right to have their evidence reviewed and acted upon, and to get a lawful and a fair outcome, which ultimately is the right outcome for their children. I don't think anybody would dispute that. So I think this is about us coming together, approaching Parliament effectively, raising public awareness to help Parliament along. And I think that's the end of my diatribe. Yeah, so again, it's an urgent call for help. This was 2019. Theresa May rejected a call from 120 MPs for a public inquiry into the family courts. Let's make it happen now. Theresa May has since written a book about the abuse of power. She talks about Hillsborough. She talks about Rotherham. We need to get the family courts onto the agenda. It is an election year. We need to get real about the real problems, which are very serious, fundamental. They're democracy issues. Let's do it. Please join me. I'll put the link in the chat again, you know, if you want to sign up. And we've got some time for a few questions, just 20 minutes until we start our session on health. Okay, let's have a look. Have we got any hands raised? I haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat because it was too much. Here we go. Adoptee Watch UK, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm an ex-mental health monitor that worked in PPI forums and the links, the local involvement networks, and we monitored mental health and parts of social care. And the Tories destroyed that particular network. We didn't do it for funding. We did it voluntarily. And my issue as an adoptee was I came across quite a number of people that had come from social care and had gone into mental health, and adoptees too, and they'd been child abused. They had been child abused, there was absolutely no doubt. I was skilled enough to see this because I'd had probably about 30 years then of psychotherapy, and very deep psychotherapy, and I'd had to face all the pain. And listening to everybody here has really raised hell in me. But the question for me is learning from this post office scandal, I noticed that something that was very similar in the mental health scenarios and the social care scenarios, which was that fragmentation and isolation of individuals was happening, and it was encouraged by the system until we formed the, in quotes, the service user movement, which wasn't really a movement, and it became very corrupted by parts of Labour. That particular, in quotes, movement did. But there were service users who were able to get together and able to coalesce and measure experience. Now, this is what we're not doing. I think some people are. I think Tracy's been doing that. Tracy Norton and Anne Neal have certainly been putting their best foot forward and actually creating stats about experience that then go forward to be shoved into the media to say to everybody out there, these designs and systems are failing. Because we say they're failing because we're bottom-up people, and by numbers they're failing. And this is the kind of thing we did as monitors. And I noticed that the post office scandal, which is extremely interesting, was simply not monitored. Has anybody got that drift? I mean, it was not monitored. And each person was a fragment. Each person was isolated. And therefore, at least part of the solution must be that we gather together, and we may have to do several kinds of surveys which create measurements and statistics of people's experiences, which then go forward via social media. I would say it must be done bottom up. I cannot agree with top-down ways of working. I never did as a monitor. We worked bottom up, and we took straight back to boards of trusts what the experience of people were at the hands of staff and at the hands of other people. And that was the way we tried to improve matters. And I suggest that we try our best to influence the social media and legacy media and MPs and use numerous strategies, but that we back it by some figures. Otherwise, we are going to be left with individuals with terrifically painful and brilliant stories of well, how can I put it? Tragic stories, really, but they're brilliant stories that really show up so many different problems. Those are the kind of stories we need collected together by survey, probably several types of surveys, probably pilot surveys as well, so that we know how we're going to get this right. That's where I'm coming from. That's the big message that I would like to punch across and learn from that post office scandal. I think that post office scandal is a piece of leverage. I think we can start to open up the other issues that are not monitored, the other issues that are where we're all fragmented, the other issues where we're isolated. I don't like the isolation. I personally lived for years and years and years in isolation and pain until I met the adoptee community. And then I suddenly realized, my God, you know, some of these people are suffering exactly the kinds of abuses that I suffered, the child abuses, the lack of guidance, and so on and so forth. So let us use methods which de-isolate, defragment, and actually monitor, so that we've got several particular ways to cohere and bring things together in an integrated vision. And crack on and do it. Not once. I mean, there's no knockout blow here, colleagues. There's no knockout blow here. This is a way of doing something across years. We all know that. So that's what I think we need to be doing. And I hope you'll think about that. Okay.
Sure. I'm just putting into a chat that Phil from the Dark Web podcast has done a survey recently of 500 litigants in family law, so that should be coming out soon, and that might be helpful. Thanks very much there, Paul. Carol, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Basically, I have a strong connection to a community over in Spain. The reason why they cannot get into that village, the social services, they are literally banned from the village, is because as soon as a person is in trouble, the community comes around them. Also, a social worker came home to the village. She was guided always around the village, but she didn't find the home. It was the community protecting the community. And that's what I think we should build here.
Yeah. Yes, I think they're very much so. I think the sort of isolation of certain, individuals is very, very damaging, and definitely sort of community support seems to be a theme that keeps coming out when people talk about, especially the child protection cases. Yeah, thank you. I think Marie's got her hand up. I'm not quite sure who was first. I think I've lost track a little bit. Marie, would you like to go ahead?
Oh, hi. Yes, I just would like to say that's 100% my thinking is we need lots of statistics, like the Dark World podcast recently, the surveys, and I think we need official bodies to criticise the current situation, because if you try to raise it, I happen to be a member of the judiciary, which I'm deeply ashamed of, and I've tried to raise it with McFarlane by email and he took disciplinary action against me. They don't think there's a problem. It's run by these elderly white men who all know each other and they think they're doing a grand job. They need to be shown. The first step is to show them that they're not doing an okay job. And that's why I'm sort of plugging the UN, I think, is actually that's someone official who can't be shut up by them, who's actually going to collate stories and information and say, the UK is not doing a very good job here. There's room for improvement, and that gives us a platform to then start building from, doesn't it?
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Maureen. If you would be able to sort of join our community and help maybe advise on how we can advocate, with the judiciary. And, I fully believe we should, if we can, try and do it by taking the heat out. We've got to be prepared to listen as well as speak, but we've got some very powerful messages. But if you can work with us, that would be absolutely amazing. Anne, I'm so sorry. I think I've lost control over the, what do you call it? Order of the hands up. But Anne, I did see your hand up go early. Would you like to go ahead?
Okay, thanks, Natalie. And thanks. I didn't catch the name of the man from Adoptee Watch, but yeah, one of the sort of one tactic that we've really tried is to put out there what is actually happening in family courts and, gather statistics and that kind of information so that people actually get a sense of what's happening. And I think, if we could get something like a group, a group case like the post office workers did, I think that would be really fantastic. And obviously it needs some thinking about how to frame that and what information we need. But I do think that is potentially really important, because I do think, but I also think, there are things that obviously the whole system needs overhauling. But there are also parts of the system that we can also press to be overhauled perhaps more quickly. For example, the abolition of the presumption of contact, which the presumption of contact was one of the issues that the harm report flagged up, which you mentioned, Natalie. And the government responded by saying, oh, we'll have another review body into it, even though the harm report was quite specific that it ought to be abolished. So the government has got some review body that's still going on, as far as I know, maybe nearly 3 years later. But pressing for that change in legislation is something that, we can all be doing, as is pressing for the abolition of the, quote, future emotional harm, which is, oh, thanks very much, Brian, Paul, okay. As is the abolition of future emotional harm, which is something that is, used over and over again. So I do think, and the reinstatement, I do think that legal aid is crucial. It's not easy to be a litigant in person. I'm not saying, I'm not saying nobody should. Obviously, if you feel able to, you go for it, but it's really not easy. And I think there ought to be legal aid. And one of the things that we talk a lot about as well is, yes, there are a lot of crap lawyers out there, but part of what we're all trying to do is to hold them to account. And so, there are ways that you just have to stay on their case and insist that they do act on your behalf, rather than just tell you, oh, the judge isn't going to like that, so don't ask for it. Okay, the judge might not like it, but that is what I am asking for, and stick to your guns. Those kinds of discussions which you can have. In relation to the adoption, it would be really helpful if there were any figures. It's quite hard to find figures about adoptions that have actually broken down. either completely or in part. And perhaps we can have a chat with the adoptee watch people, because you may have stats about that. I think that would be important, because adoption is always flagged up as the gold standard, etc., which of course we all know it's not. In relation to what you were saying about the women's refuges, Natalie, I think we have to be cautious. I've never heard the things that you were saying. I'm open-minded, but I do think that refuges have been a place where women can go, if they're facing homelessness or trying to get away from an abusive man. And so you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think is the phrase, because we do need refuges. We need refuges which are independent, and where the people who work in them do act on women's behalf and the children's behalf, rather than perhaps, I know some refuges are much more closely embedded with the police, for example, and Women Against Rape, who are part of our coalition, have spoken out about that. But people like the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, I think the issue is we have to press them to go further than they would otherwise want to. And I think in some cases Nicole Jacobs has made some strong statements. In other cases she very definitely hasn't. And I know the Children's Commissioner is very lacking. But the issue is, how can we expose their weaknesses and make them speak more strongly on behalf of the people that that they are supposed to represent. But I just think we should be a bit careful that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot with some of the resources that there are, that we want to be better. Do you know what I mean? I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a tricky one. I appreciate your insights there, and it's definitely a bit of a tightrope here.
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks ever so much, Anne. We've only got 6 minutes left because we don't want to run into Julia's time, who's going to be speaking about healthcare and the way that the children's families with disabilities are treated. So I'd love to hear from the Access to Justice Foundation. Would it be okay if we let her go, because she hasn't spoken yet, and I think that she's probably got something very crucial to say, and hopefully we can also get at least one more of you in before we hand over to Julia.
Hi Natalie, I hope everyone can hear me, and it's amazing to see everyone come together in one place, because this really is where the power is. It's victims at grassroots level who have had first-hand experience of the failings of the legal system that we have placed our trust in. And they have done everything they can to silence us. So using post office scandal template, I think, in my opinion, that the very best way we can move forward is now to come together, to keep doing these meetings, Natalie, which are incredibly powerful, encourage through our own networks to bring more people forward that are prepared to build their case to come into a group class action against the state. Because the policy that government has implemented, as far back as the video that you suggested with Tony Blair, Natalie, the policy has failed, and the agencies supporting and influencing those policies into CAFCAS, into the police, into social workers, local authority, into GPs, it has had a detrimental constitutional breach of our human rights. So there needs to be a joint class action group where we come forward with one voice, with one very clear message. Your system has failed us and has failed our children. This is state interference. It is state psychological induced trauma. We have gone to all the regulators, they have silenced us. We have gone to the police, they have failed to act in their duty of candor to protect us as victims and protect our children. We have used the court system where they have failed to apply the rule of law and respect the very policies and procedures and case law that they have to apply to our individual cases. This is malfeasance. That's it. It's a group action. So it's a class action group that needs to come forward. I know from the charity that I have that we're speaking to litigation funders, where more than likely they're going to turn around and say we want at least 250 people to bring on a class action case. So we're at 55 on this call now. Imagine if we did this on a monthly basis and we encouraged more and more people. Our role would be to teach people how to bundle, how to evidence, how to get their case up to a standard that can prove malfeasance. And if everyone can come up to that standard in a uniformed way, then the litigation funders would take on the case, do a pre-action letter to the government for malfeasance and say, this is what we're asking for. And any money awarded would be able to be used to set up the reforms that you're suggesting, Natalie, which are very powerful. And we would be in control of that as the people, not the politicians. So, because I don't believe that any amount of money can take away the pain and suffering that victims and children have suffered. It's never going to bring that time back. But with, you know, millions and millions of pounds, we could create a mechanism that will support victims going forward, whether that's educating professionals, whether that's re-educating social workers, however that mechanism ends up being manifested. I'm sure we'll get to that place in due course. But I think as an absolute priority, we need to be able to facilitate these meetings to bring people up to a standard to prove the case of malfeasance, state interference, breach of constitutional human rights, ready for litigation funders to come on and take a class action group forward. That's what I think needs to happen, because every victim endures the same problem, which is we're all silenced. The regulators never want to look at the evidence. The police don't want to get involved. No one wants to take accountability. So when it's multiple people speaking from one place, that's the power. They cannot deny that. And it is a pattern what they're doing. It's very, very clear. So thank you for listening. Look, that's just really my suggestion of where 2024 should go. It's a class action group. And if we can all come together, that is the power.
Thank you ever so much. I think that there's a lot of value in that you said. However, I would disagree. I think that the government has got enough money to be funding this reform, which is way, way, way overdue. And I believe it would pay for itself. And we do deserve compensation because of the enormous harm inflicted on us. It's caused us multiple damages, and we do need that compensation to be able to recover. We shouldn't deny ourselves. But then again, I can't speak for all people. Martin, I'm ever so sorry. I'm going to have to ask you, because we have heard from you earlier, if you've got something to say, if you could drop it in the chat, because we need to move on to Julia's session now. Right after that, we've got Roly Post, who's going to be sharing some absolutely, what would you call it, eye-watering insights from the inside story of the lobbies in child protection internationally. So I hope that that's going to be really, we just have to click on. We've got almost no breathing space. I probably should have factored in a few more weeks